those are fingerprints.
Yeah, like that's kind of a big
It's
deal.
not like he put somebody else's hands on to commit the murder and then walked out. Like, that's not how it works.
Hi, I'm Lila.
And I'm Chansey.
And this is for Criming Out Loud.
Yes, it is. This week, to start, I just want to tell a story that I feel like is a cautionary tale for all Americans everywhere. I read the story this week about a woman who woke up and was surprised that she'd been declared dead.
What?
She was just
Excuse
going
me?
about her life, and she found out that she had been reported as deceased.
Oh, okay. That was a little bit different than I thought that was.
That was meant to be that way. There was supposed to be a little bit of shock factor. Okay. No, she went in to renew her driver's license. So that's where our story starts, in the DMV. And she was told that she could not renew her license because she was dead.
What do you even do with that information?
So
really?
She was like, I had no idea what to do. So she started making some calls, and she was like, it appears that I am deceased. That's a straight up quote.
It appears so.
So she basically what happened is, when I didn't know anything about what happens when you get reported dead, but apparently everybody gets informed that's got their fingers in your government identity. So her health insurance got canceled. So she's a single mom of 3 kids, and all of a sudden she doesn't have health insurance. Anyway, so it just basically really messed up her life, and then she gets a call from the Social Security office a little bit later, and they were basically just like, we're sorry we screwed up your life, but it was a typo.
What?
Literally, a funeral home had been reporting somebody else dead, and they mixed up the numbers on the Social Security number that they were reporting, and it ended up being her instead of the actual deceased person. And so they just went with it, and it just whatever. So this is why I say it's a cautionary tale, because apparently there are about 10,000 reports every year, death reports, that get messed up every year.
My gosh.
So that's not great. You could be reported dead anytime. It reminds me, there's a Grace and Frankie episode for anybody that's ever watched that show. It's wonderful. But Frankie gets reported dead too. There's this weird episode where she's she can't get anything done because she's been reported deceased.
Yeah, I do remember that.
That's a good episode. Go watch that show.
I do love that show.
So there you go. Now you know you could be reported dead anytime. Watch out for that.
I was literally
everywhere.
waiting for this to be a buried alive situation.
No.
And I was freaking out.
That's what I first thought when I saw the headline, which is why I clicked on it.
They know how to get
you know, they got me. I wanted you guys to experience the exact same thing that I felt, which was what? And then just straight up disappointment. So that's the story to start out this week.
It's still exciting. That's still intense. Somebody's just you're dead.
You've been wiped from the face of the earth.
Clearly not. I would
literally look at myself and be like, are you sure? What are we doing? I'm clearly not dead.
I am here in the flesh.
Here I stand before you.
No, anyways. That's wild. I guess I will just watch out for signs of being reported dead, like your
rogue typos,
insurance being dropped out of the blue.
Out of the blue. Oh gosh.
Okay, let's get into the story for today. Today we're talking about a woman named Susan Woods, and she was brutally murdered in her home in Texas in 1987. So,
dang.
Yeah, we'll get into it. Yeah. Yep, there you go. There's your intro. So, Susan Woods, she grew up in Stephenville, Texas, and she lived there her whole life. And she was described by her best friend as shy and timid, but a happy go lucky person. And Susan, she was also like an avid car enthusiast. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's kind of what we know about Susan. And when she was 23 years old, she married her husband Michael Woods, and he was a guy that didn't really fit into their small Texas town. This was like a cowboy town. There were a lot of straight laced people in this town, and he had like a rocker vibe and was not really appreciated. He was known for his long hair and his leather jacket wearing, and yeah, it didn't sit well with most people in this town, in Stephenville. So even though the rest of the town wasn't really a fan of Michael Woods, Susan obviously was. They got married. He thought she was the best thing ever, and she thought he was the best thing ever. And for a short time, life was really good. But according to Susan's friends, Susan ended up working at a sandpaper factory, and Michael spent a lot of time sleeping, watching TV, and just playing around. Wasn't really doing much of anything. And so, while their marriage lasted for several years, they were not very happy ones, and it ended in divorce in the early 1987. So they were married for about 7 years.
That's always such a bummer when a guy turns out to be a lazy piece of, you
Yeah.
know.
So what really ended their marriage was that Michael, he wanted to move back to Indiana where he was from to help his brother with an apartment building that he'd bought, and Susan was like, "Nah, I think I'm going to stay here." And Michael left Susan, and along with leaving her, he left behind some very nasty, hateful notes and a cassette tape with a list of grievances of why it had been Susan's fault that their marriage had failed. So it didn't end pleasantly. He turned out to be a real dirtbag in the end. And basically, it was like, yeah, a long list of why she was a biatch. So,
Wow.
um, yeah,
Straight laced, super nice guy.
awesome, Michael. Real cool move on your part.
Super
So,
classy, Michael.
yeah, and it's like he's not even ballsy enough to say it to her face. He's like leaving her notes that she just found. Like, can you
Here's
imagine your husband like leaves you and it's like just a trail of like hateful notes, and you're like, really? Okay, whatever, man.
okay, Michael. Sounds good.
So, but to like friends and family that read the notes, he basically put her down in any and every way he could, and it was very offensive. So, I mean, we can make light, but it wasn't very
Was
wasn't
not an
wasn't
not
awesome for her. Didn't
not
make
good.
her feel great, obviously.
Not nice.
So, however, despite the ugly ending to her marriage, Susan was eager to move on, and within a couple months of her divorce, she started to date. And she was very happy at this point. She seemed to have a bright future ahead of her, without a marriage that was kind of dragging her down. Um, However, that bright future would be cut short very quickly. Um, just 5 months after her divorce, Susan missed 2 days of work, and her superintendent started to make some calls to try and figure out why she wasn't showing up. And first, he called her father, and he went over to Susan's house to check on her. And the scene he found was brutal and horrifying,
Oh
and
gosh.
he immediately called 911. And the detectives that arrived would later report the scene that they found. And they described the scene as this: Susan's naked body was slumped over the bathtub, and her hands were tied behind her back with what appeared to be a tank top. Her head was in the bathtub, drowned in water. Her neck sustained marks that showed she was most likely strangled by what they would find later as a cord, like an electrical cord. And they think this happened at some point before she was drowned. There were fingerprints left in several places all over the bathroom, which will become important later in this investigation. The bedroom held clear signs of a struggle. The mattress was hanging over the bed. There was scuff marks on the floor that made it look like the bed had been moved. They found what they believed was the electrical cord that had been used to strangle her, and it was lying on the bed, and a pillow seemed to have makeup on it that suggested to the investigators that her attacker had probably shoved Susan's face into it during their struggle in an attempt to suffocate her. Um, then they also found that the living room looks like Susan had been entertaining a guest. The TV was on, there was an ashtray with cigarette butts, which they took note she didn't smoke, so they had to believe somebody else was there with her. There were snacks and drinks left on the table. Looks like she'd been having a good time with somebody. And later, the police would confirm that Susan had also sustained an attempted rape. They ruled her cause of
Attempted?
death as, yeah, I didn't get any details. Just every source I read said attempted rape.
Hmm. I don't know
So
if I've
I'm
ever
not,
heard that before.
yeah,
I'm like
not quite
in
sure
a case where they're
what,
when they die, like when they're murdered.
yeah.
I honestly
So
didn't know that you could even
I don't
find
know.
evidence of that.
I don't
So
know if it was just like because she was naked
that they like
and
assumed
just
it was a
the
sexual
the
assault.
way that it was, yeah, I don't know. But yeah.
That's
And
scary.
they ruled her cause of death as either drowning or asphyxiation.
That makes sense with the
So
electrical cord and the water.
I
It's
don't think they
terrible.
could really tell what. I mean, in
What
my mind, if
actually
she's
caused it?
found in the bathtub, she probably drowned. But
I just like the cases that we talk about where like what happens to the victims is so brutal that they can't even tell what it actually was that killed them because they were attacked so viciously is just
yeah,
heartbreaking. Like,
yeah, no, really.
ugh,
Well, and
terrible.
it's like this whoever this was, like they're looking at this and they're like they like tried like three different things. It was like let's stuff her face in a pillow, let's
Yeah,
strangle her. That didn't work. I mean, that's just awful.
that's horrible. It's like getting murdered in four different ways instead of just one way.
Yeah.
It's
Ugh.
horrific
Yeah. So really terrible scene and really terrible that Susan's father is the one that had to find her like
to
that.
find her. Ugh, I always hate it when
So
the family finds the bodies. It's
I know.
almost always them because they're the ones that live
Like
in
are
the same
worried.
places and are worried about them
Yeah.
and still terrible though.
So really awful. The police they looked into several men that Susan had dated first. This included her boyfriend at the time, but they were all ruled out pretty quickly. And it didn't take very long for the police to find their star suspect, her ex-husband Michael. So the police they actually drove out to Michael's house in Indiana to bring him in and question him. And they kind of just like without any like context just started rapid fire questioning Michael about the time that he was with Susan in Texas. And Michael claimed to them that he had been in Indiana the whole time. And he was like, what is this even about? And they then told him that they had found Susan dead in her house. And the police recall that Michael immediately ran to the bathroom and vomited and said that this was the first time like he had no clue that that happened.
Okay.
And so he actually was very cooperative. He gave DNA samples and whatever else the police asked from him, and but maintained his innocence and told them that he had nothing to do with it and that he'd been states away the entire time. But after not believing him and thoroughly questioning him over and over again to try and get him to confess, he clammed up and asked for a lawyer.
I'm not gonna lie,
Um,
just to play devil's advocate, because that does seem suspicious. It's also like if they're like if they won't believe you when you're telling them the truth and being cooperative and they're like ramping up their interrogation, I would call a lawyer too. I would have called a lawyer before I even said anything to anybody. But
yeah, well, and they really ambushed him because like they took him in without even telling him what it was about and questioned him without even telling him
yeah,
like
no.
the purpose behind it. It wasn't like we're arresting you for the like they had no evidence. They have nothing. So The investigators eventually had to let him go because they compared his fingerprints to those found at the crime scene, and it was not a match.
No dice.
And so they didn't have any grounds to hold him. They didn't let go that easily, though, because they also got a search warrant for his house. That revealed nothing, no links to him and Susan's death. So they just kind of had to let Michael be. Um, and even though Michael was, you know, innocent as far as anybody could tell, he was believed to have been the murderer by the public for decades after her death, as long as it went unsolved, because there was just no better suspect to stand in for him. And the police were really, really biased against him because they had Susan's parents who were basically breathing down their neck telling the police that that's who murdered their daughter. And the police had no better suspects and they believed them. And so the police also never officially announced that he had been removed from the suspect list altogether.
That is such a jerk move. I
So no, it's really like tragic though in this case because he really is he's just like the second victim of this case because not to spoil anything, but Michael didn't do it. And he's harassed for like 20 years of his life and believed to be like a criminal. Susan's family actually was like so convinced of his guilt that they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him and they won. And it was like he refused to actually show up to his trial, and because of that, like his charges ended up being over $700,000. And so he obviously didn't have the money to pay for that, and the only way to get out of it was that he could never return to the state because upon entry into the state he would have owed that money. And so he just never went back to Texas for 20 years because
gosh,
they had filed that suit against him.
that's just like such a hard
So,
situation because like I get like families they have to grieve things and it would be horrible to think that somebody killed your child and that they just got away with it. But you have to like I'm sure I feel like the police are at fault for this a little bit because I feel like if they had just been honest about what they'd learned from Michael, like that he was cooperative and gave DNA and the fingerprints didn't match. Like I'm sure the parents knew some of that, but they may not have known all of it. But
yeah,
for me, it's like if somebody willingly gives a DNA sample and fingerprints over to police, they're not guilty. I have
no,
I have in all of my true crime years, I have never heard of a actually I can think of one where they like knew they were guilty, they were the killer, and then they willingly gave their DNA. And it was only so that they could buy time to run across the border.
yeah,
It
yeah,
wasn't like
exactly.
an end all be all thing. They didn't
Yeah.
just like willingly hand over their DNA without the police like basically getting a court order for it.
Well,
So,
and it's like really hard. It's like he lived states away from this. Too. Like there just really was nothing
well, and yeah,
holding
like
him
the
to the crime.
the fingerprints don't match. Those are fingerprints.
Yeah, like that's kind of a big
It's not
deal.
like he put somebody else's hands on to commit the murder and then walked out. Like that's not how it
Yeah,
works. So I
exactly.
have a hard time because I feel like this family was just like clinging to whatever they could to try and get closure and to grieve and whatever. But it also really sucks that they went after this guy so hard when he hadn't done anything
Yeah.
and
Yeah, and
ruined his
I
life basically.
I can yeah, exactly. And I can imagine like it's similar to like when you imagine people going to prison for something they didn't do. Except
Yeah.
this is worse because it not worse, but in a different way worse because you're like out among the world and
And
everybody's just
everybody
like
just thinks
hating
you're a
on you.
murderer
Yeah.
and you're not.
So it wasn't until nearly 15 years later, after Susan's murder, that the truth would be uncovered. And that happened when Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville. You know how Stephen can sometimes be spelled with a PH?
Like Stefan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, every time I see it, I want to say Stephenville.
Stephenville.
Ugh, it's not Stephenville. Stephenville police sent some of the evidence from Susan's crime scene, including the cigarette butts found at the scene, to a DNA lab. And it was discovered to be male DNA, and there were no other matches in the system,
Of course
which
not.
we assumed.
Yeah.
We thought it was a male, so nothing new there. Um, but then in 2006, this being about 4 years after that, 19 years after Susan's death, Miller, the detective on this case, he got another break in the case he wasn't expecting. And the fingerprints that had been taken from the crime scene had gotten pinged as a match to a man by the name of Joseph Scott Hatley, who turned out to be the younger brother of one of Susan's closest friends. And what's
I
crazy
just
is upon looking into him, they immediately noticed that he had actually attended the funeral for Susan and signed the guest book and everything.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But just do some due diligence and actually look into the people in her life. I don't know. Instead of
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
tunneling in on one guy who wasn't even in the state when it happened. Maybe look at other potential people. Like, who does she know that smokes? Look into the men, all the men that she has any connection to. It's a small town. People will tell you. You might
Yeah.
already know them.
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Well,
just feel like
and
that's something that could totally be solvable. Like,
she
it's
spent time with him, with Hatley, 3 or 4 days before she was murdered by him.
so somebody would have
And
known.
so it was yeah, she spent time with him and her best friend and her boyfriend 3 days before her murder. So it wasn't even
Yeah.
a far cry to notice that
No.
this guy was a part of her
Like,
life.
they would have looked
He
into
was
him if
right
they'd
there.
done any sort of investigating.
Yeah, and her crime wouldn't have gone unsolved for this many years because, yeah,
That
we'll
just
get
feels
into
like
it. But
gross negligence. Anyways, go on.
yeah. So, as far as they knew at the time, Hatley, he'd often been known to pester his older sister's friends, but he had always seemed really harmless. But things had changed after he had done a stint in the Air Force. He he came back and started drinking heavily, but didn't appear mean or violent or anything at that point. He just was always on a bender. And this everybody thinking that he was just drinking and non-violent would be proven false years later when it actually come to light that a year after he murdered Susan, he actually had been accused by his 16-year-old girlfriend of being held against her will and repeatedly being raped and beaten by him.
How old was
Um,
he when this happened?
he was early-ish 20s, mid 20s.
So he's a
So
pedophile and also
yeah, so it
a
wasn't legal.
rapist and a murderer. Great.
Yeah, because 16-year-olds. Yeah. Um, this whole thing had taken place by a creek, and he had actually escalated to the point that he was holding her head under the water and threatening to kill her. And also at this time had mentioned that he had killed before.
Oh gosh. That's so scary.
So what's terrible about this is that she claims that she passed out several times because he was beating her on the face and head so much. But then after she escapes him by basically agreeing that she's in love with him and playing into it.
You gotta play along.
And he apologizes after and says, "I'm so sorry, I love you so much," blah blah blah. Gross. And then she makes it out and just pretends like it's not a big deal. But then she goes and tells the police and they don't believe her. And not really that they don't believe her, but more they don't have any evidence to do anything
Get
with.
some.
Although I'm confused because I was I'm
She
sorry, she
was
has
beat to death,
beaten
basically.
on the face. So,
No
yeah.
evidence. That's assault.
Yeah.
Whatever. I'm not
So,
loving this police department.
no. So, Hatley was never charged for the assault on his girlfriend. He basically got away with it until years later when the limelight came back on him, and then this story became a little bit more relevant. But he was arrested for the murder of Susan in 2006, like I said. And while behind bars, he agreed to plead guilty to the charges. And in exchange, he offered up some details about a different case against another suspect in exchange for a 30-year sentence. What is
Okay.
wild is he only ended up serving 12 years before being released on parole in 2018.
So he's just out in the world,
He like murdered people.
like straight up murdered women.
Well, almost murdered two people. So, yeah, but however, karma did come for him, and he only lived a few years outside of prison before he got bladder cancer and died in 2021. So,
At least he's not terrorizing women anymore.
no, he's
Gosh.
gone. What's wild is that his story doesn't end there. After his death, he the police actually get a call from somebody that claimed that they bought Hatley's trailer that he had died in, and that they had uncovered a bunch of really scary stuff,
Oh
and that it
gosh.
was over 200 pages of writings that Hatley had about his life. He had basically written his own autobiography. And the writings detailed how he had struggled to fit in at school when he was a kid, how he had battled violent thoughts throughout his childhood. He wrote at one point that he tried to kill his mother because she was known to like slap him and it really pissed him off. But he also wrote about that night with Susan. And in his account, he wrote that he thought that Susan had been flirting with him the couple days before her murder. And so the night of her murder, he had come over to her house. And according to him, they had talked and he had overstepped his boundaries, at which point Susan slapped him. And he claims that what happened next was a blur, but in his own words, he brutalized her and used a pillow to try and suffocate her. And then he wrote, "She was alive. I could have stopped, but I didn't." And he continued
Yeah.
to do what we know happened next. So, anyway, he's a true monster. He actually says that about himself. He said that he turned into a monster. Um, cause yeah,
Sometimes
yeah.
I feel like when killers say that, I just feel like they're just trying to take the blame off of themselves. Like, it's not my choices. I didn't do that. It's just because there's something wrong with me. I'm just a monster.
Well, at one
Okay,
point in this,
yeah,
like,
but also,
yeah, at one point in this manuscript, he said he actually prayed to Satan. I don't remember at what point it was, whether it was before or after Susan's murder, but I think it was before because then he claimed that that was the reason he murdered Susan was because he had given
like,
Satan power over him,
yeah.
which is
Well,
really intense.
sure.
So,
I just feel like there's it's always a mixed bag with these people, right? Like there's always a mix of like environment and genetics and whatever, the nurture versus nature, whatever. But I just feel like when you're like actively seeking to do things that don't align with normal like society's normal morals, you
yeah,
just that you're not a monster, you're choosing to be a monster.
yeah, no, exactly.
There you have it.
Yeah. And this guy, like, well, I think it says a lot the fact that, like, even from his, like, young childhood, he, like, had violent tendencies.
Yeah, for
Like,
sure.
it's in some people, and that's really scary and sad. But sometimes it's not just about the way somebody was raised.
No.
So, the last things that he said about that night when he murdered Susan was that he had driven by the police station on his way home and had considered for a few minutes turning himself in. He, of course, decided not to, and 4 days later, he said that he read the story of her murder in the newspaper and experienced a high like he had never felt before. He felt no remorse for the crime, went to her funeral, and basically just said he never felt sorry for it until he died. So,
I just can't picture that. Like killing somebody and then showing up at their funeral like I wasn't the one that murdered them and just acting normal. That's
Yeah, like
just
signing the guest
that's just
list.
crazy. Yeah.
And he said that he stood in the funeral and felt like some sort of weird pride that he was watching everybody mourning her
That's a
and
real
was like
psychopath
almost
right there.
prideful of the fact that nobody knew it was him, that he felt like he'd already gotten away with it.
Ugh, that's gross.
So, yeah.
Whatever. Whatever. Well, at
And
least he
that
got
is the
caught
story.
eventually.
Yeah, that's the story of Susan Woods and the monster. The monster that murdered her for literally no reason, just because he was a pig. So,
Wow. That was a brutal one.
tip of the week. Don't invite don't invite guests over to your house or let them in. I don't think Mr. Hatley was invited. But if they show up at your doorstep, just don't let people in you don't want in there. Just say
Yeah.
no.
It's like vampire rules. Don't invite
Yep.
somebody
There you
in
go.
and then they can never come in your house. It'll be totally great.
There you
Honestly,
go.
just avoid people. People can be just wild. So,
Yeah. The end of every story. It's never your fault when misfortune befalls you.
no. Just got to avoid all the people that
So,
could make the crazy stuff
yeah.
happen.
There you have it.
Oh, goodness. All right, everybody, stay frosty.
Bye.